Welcome to your storytelling. Enjoy the stories, and don't forget to subscribe. Every Saturday, he dressed in his golf attire, smart pants, a crisp shirt, and a sleek jacket. He'd kiss my forehead, telling me he'd be back by noon. His promise always seemed so routine. I never questioned it, until the day everything changed. He'd always been a mystery in some ways, but I trusted him, or at least, I thought I did. But when I began to notice the strange absence of any golf-related conversations or scorecards, a nagging suspicion slowly crept in. There were too many details that didn't add up. The clubs were always perfectly clean, as if they'd never been used. Something wasn't right, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being left out of something important. I tried to dismiss it at first. Maybe I was just being paranoid. But then, the clues kept piling up. He'd return home, smile, and casually say, "Great game," but never shared any details, no scores, no memorable holes. It was like he was playing a game I wasn't invited to. I'd catch glimpses of his golf bag, tucked away in the corner of the closet, still pristine. No sign of wear. If he'd been golfing every weekend as he said, surely it would show. And the golf course? I never even knew where he went. His golf buddies were always conveniently busy when I asked about meeting them. He never gave me any real details. It felt like he was hiding something. Something inside me shifted. I couldn't just sit back and ignore the oddities any longer. That Saturday, I decided to follow him. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched him leave the house, his golf bag slung casually over his shoulder. I pretended to go about my own business, but my eyes never left him. As he drove off, I slipped into my car and followed at a safe distance. His route was unfamiliar, winding through neighborhoods I didn't recognize. All the while my mind raced with possibilities. Where was he going? A golf course I didn't know about? But then, my gut told me it wasn't that simple. I could feel it. This was something far beyond just a game of golf. He took a sharp turn onto a narrow street, and I slowed down, keeping a safe distance. The road grew more isolated, and I began to wonder if I'd made a mistake. Was I overreacting? But then, up ahead, I saw it. A sleek, black building that looked out of place in the quiet neighborhood. No sign, no windows. My heart dropped. This was no golf course. He parked his car in front, checked his surroundings, and then, without hesitation, entered the building. The door closed behind him, and I was left standing there in shock. 1,000 questions flooded my mind. What was this place? What was he doing here? And who was he meeting? I had to know. I waited, watching the building for any sign of movement. My mind spun with possibilities, each one more bizarre than the last. Could he be meeting someone? Was this some secret club he joined? And if so, why hadn't he ever mentioned it? The minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Finally, a woman passed by the entrance, her heels clicking against the pavement. She swiped a gold card, and the door opened for her without question. She was greeted with a smile from the bouncer, who nodded as she entered. My stomach twisted. Gold card? This was no ordinary club. What kind of place was this? And why did my husband have access to it? My mind raced. I couldn't just sit here and watch. I needed to know what was inside, what kind of world he'd been a part of. My hands shook as I pulled the car into a nearby alley, out of sight of the building's entrance. My thoughts were frantic, but I had to stay calm. I couldn't let him know I was following him. Slowly, I crept toward the side of the building, my heart pounding in my ears. I needed to find another way in. The entrance was guarded, and I knew if I tried to approach directly, I'd be turned away. But there had to be another way. I circled the building, looking for any opening, any sign of a hidden entrance. I found it, a small door, barely cracked open. My heart leaped in my chest, but I quickly stilled myself. If I was going to find answers, this was my chance. The door was almost unnoticeable against the dark, imposing structure of the building. I hesitated for a moment, my breath shallow as I checked over my shoulder. No one was around. I pushed the door open just enough to slip inside, trying to make as little noise as possible. My eyes adjusted to the dim lighting as I crept down a narrow hallway. The air was thick with tension, as though the building itself was hiding secrets. What was going on here? What kind of place had my husband been visiting every weekend? The hallway seemed to stretch forever, and every step I took made me more anxious. The voices grew louder as I approached a large wooden door at the end of the hall. It was slightly ajar, and I could see shadows moving inside. I held my breath, pressing my ear against the door. Laughter. Deep, masculine voices. A clink of glasses. They were celebrating something, and from the way they spoke, it was clear this wasn't a casual gathering. This was intimate, private. My curiosity burned, but fear gripped me. What if I was wrong? What if I had misjudged everything? No, I couldn't back out now. I had to see for myself. I had to know the truth. I stood still, gathering the courage to peek through the gap in the door. My pulse raced in my ears. Slowly, I leaned in and saw him. There he was, my husband, laughing, surrounded by strangers in sharp suits. His usual stoic expression had melted away, replaced by an ease I'd never seen before. He was at home here, as if this place was where he truly belonged. He fit in perfectly, his posture relaxed, as though he had been part of this group for years. My heart sank. This wasn't the man I married. I had no idea what kind of life he'd been living when I wasn't looking, but I had to know more. I needed to understand what he was doing here, with these people. As I watched him interact, I noticed something strange. A woman, tall with striking dark hair, was seated close to him, whispering something in his ear. Her laughter was low and smooth, and my stomach churned. She seemed too comfortable with him, as though she had an intimate relationship with him, something more than just casual conversation. My mind spun with possibilities. Was she just a friend, or was there more between them? My heart twisted at the thought. He'd never once mentioned her to me. In fact, I didn't know any of these people. They were strangers, yet he acted as though he was part of their world. The distance between us felt wider than ever before. I couldn't just stand there forever. My heart pounded, but I knew I needed to move. I couldn't risk being caught. I backed away from the door, my steps light but hurried. I was so close now, so close to the answers I'd been searching for. But at the same time, fear gnawed at me. What would I do once I had the answers? How could I confront him? I didn't know if I was ready to face the truth, but I couldn't go on pretending that everything was fine when it so clearly wasn't. My thoughts raced as I waited for the moment when he'd finally leave this secret life behind and return to me. But the longer I stood there, the more I realized how much I didn't know about him. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours. I watched the door, waiting for him to make his exit. It was maddening, the uncertainty. My hands trembled as I clenched them into fists, trying to steady myself. Finally, the laughter inside grew louder, then faded. I took a deep breath, pushing myself to the edge of the building where I could still see the entrance. I couldn't help but wonder what he was doing inside. Was he involved in something shady? Was he lying to me about more than just golf? The questions were like a whirlpool in my mind, dragging me down further. The door finally opened, and there he was, stepping out into the night, oblivious to the storm of emotions inside me. I followed him from a distance, barely able to catch my breath. He walked with a sense of ease, his stride confident. I had to stop myself from calling out to him, from demanding answers on the spot. But the truth was, I was terrified of what he might say. How could I confront him without sounding crazy, without accusing him of things I wasn't entirely sure about? What if I was wrong? What if it was all just some misunderstanding? The doubt made my stomach turn, but I couldn't back down now. Not after everything I'd seen. After everything that didn't make sense. He had to know I was onto him, and I had to know the truth, no matter how painful it might be. We drove home in complete silence. The weight of what I had just witnessed pressed down on me like a ton of bricks. I could barely breathe, my mind spinning in circles. What kind of world had he been living in behind my back? I had no idea. The house felt empty when we got back, and I knew that something fundamental had changed between us. The truth was out there, but it was still so far from my grasp. He hadn't said a word about what I'd just seen, and neither had I. What could I say? How could I approach this? It felt like an unsolvable puzzle, one where every piece seemed to lead to more confusion and doubt. As I lay in bed that night, I kept replaying the images in my head. The woman whispering to him, his laugh, the way he seemed to belong in that place. None of it added up. The next day, I couldn't stop thinking about it. His absence had never felt more present, and I found myself obsessing over every detail, every possible explanation. I replayed everything in my mind. The building, the people, the way he looked at that woman. There were too many unanswered questions. I tried to go about my day as if everything was normal, but the tension was suffocating. I had to know what was going on. I had to confront him. But how? I couldn't just walk up to him and demand answers without knowing exactly what I was dealing with. And what if the truth was something I couldn't handle? My mind raced as I waited for him to come home, dreading the conversation that was about to happen. When he finally returned, I barely recognized him. There was a strange calm about him, a peace that I hadn't seen before. He kissed me on the cheek, like nothing had changed, like everything was just as it always was. But I knew better now. The man I had once thought I knew was a stranger to me. How could he be so unaffected by what I had seen? Was he hiding his true feelings, or was he simply too comfortable in his secret life? I watched him carefully, noticing every little detail, every movement, every word. He had no idea that I knew everything now, or at least, almost everything. I had to confront him, but how could I do it without causing an explosion? The days dragged on, each one feeling more suffocating than the last. Every time he smiled at me, every time he kissed me goodbye before leaving, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was hiding something. The man I loved seemed like a stranger. The air between us was thick with unspoken questions. I had to get to the bottom of this, but I was terrified of what I might find. What if the truth was too much to bear? What if my marriage, everything I thought I knew, was a lie? I couldn't live with the uncertainty anymore. I needed answers, but I didn't know how to ask without falling apart. Each moment felt like a ticking bomb. One afternoon, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I couldn't just wait around any longer. I had to confront him. The truth had been eating at me for days, and I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had a plan. Well, at least I thought I did. When he returned home that evening, I asked him casually about his golf meetings. I needed to test his reaction, to see if he'd finally slip up and reveal something. His response was typical, carefree, almost rehearsed. Same old, he said with a shrug. But there was something in his eyes, something that didn't match his words. He was hiding something, and I could feel it in every fiber of my being. My heart pounded as I realized that this conversation was just the beginning. I couldn't let it go. His reaction only made me more suspicious, and the doubts in my mind grew louder. That night, after he fell asleep, I couldn't help myself. I went through his things. I rifled through his pockets, his desk, his car, anything I could find. My hands were shaking, but I had to know. I found a receipt from a high-end store tucked in his jacket pocket. The item? A designer watch. It didn't make sense. He had never mentioned buying a new watch. My heart raced as I thought about how little I knew about his life outside of our home. What was he doing with all this money? What was he spending it on? I felt like I was unraveling a web, but I wasn't sure if I was ready for the truth it would reveal. The following weekend, I decided to follow him again. This time, I was more determined, more prepared. I needed to know everything, no matter how much it hurt. As I drove behind him, I felt the familiar rush of anxiety and anticipation. Where was he going this time? Would it be the same place, or was there something else I hadn't discovered yet? When he turned off the main road, I couldn't believe my eyes. He was heading toward the same building, the secret club. I parked my car at a safe distance and waited. This time, I was going to follow him inside. I couldn't just stand in the shadows anymore. I had to face whatever truth awaited me. My heart was in my throat as I approached the building. The same imposing door, the same guard standing watch. This time, I had no choice. I couldn't go back. I had to confront him, even if it meant walking into the unknown. I stood outside for a moment, gathering my courage, and then I did it. I walked up to the door, my steps echoing in the silence. I was stopped by the bouncer, who asked if I was a member. My mind raced, and without thinking, I blurted out that I was with my husband. The bouncer nodded, but there was hesitation in his eyes. Something wasn't right, but he let me in. I was finally inside, and everything was about to change. The moment I stepped into the club, the atmosphere hit me like a wave. The air was thick with the sound of conversation, laughter, and clinking glasses. The people here were nothing like the ones I'd seen at his supposed golf course. They were dressed in dark, expensive clothing, talking in hushed tones, exchanging glances that seemed to hide secrets. I scanned the room for him, my eyes darting from one corner to the next. And then, I saw him. There he was, sitting at a table with the same woman from before. Their eyes met, and for a brief moment, I swore I saw something pass between them. A connection, a shared intimacy. My stomach twisted in knots. What was going on here? What kind of world had I stumbled into? I stood frozen at the entrance, my breath catching in my throat. Everything around me felt surreal, as though I had stepped into an alternate reality. The people, the ambience, it was nothing like I had imagined. This wasn't just a golf club or a place for casual meetings. It was a world of privilege and secrecy. I watched as my husband leaned in to whisper something to the woman, his hand resting on the table in a way that felt far too intimate for a business meeting. My mind raced. Was this some sort of affair? Or was there something darker happening here? I couldn't look away, even though every part of me wanted to run out of the building. I had to see more. I had to understand what I had gotten myself into. I couldn't believe my eyes as I stood there, hidden in the shadows of the club. My husband, who I thought I knew inside and out, was a stranger to me in this place. The way he smiled at that woman, how easily they laughed together, it made my heart ache. It was a side of him I had never seen before. The more I watched, the more I realized that I had only known one version of him. This version, this man, was different. I couldn't shake the feeling that he had been leading a double life. But what was the truth? Was it an affair? Was he hiding something from me? The more I observed, the more questions piled up, each one more confusing than the last. But there was no going back now. I had to find out what my husband was really doing, no matter the cost. I left the club that night with more questions than answers. My mind was spinning, and I felt like I was on the edge of a cliff, teetering between the truth and my own denial. When I got home, I tried to act normal, but it was impossible. How could I look at him and pretend everything was fine when I knew what I knew? How could I keep up the charade when my entire world had shifted beneath my feet? As he sat beside me on the couch, talking about his day, I couldn't hear his words. All I could think about was that woman, that club, the lies. My thoughts were a whirlwind, and I was drowning in them. I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't go on pretending. I had to confront him, no matter how difficult it would be. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, all I could see was his face, the way he looked at that woman, the way he'd blended so seamlessly into this secret world. My mind kept replaying the scene from the club, his laughter, their conversation, his hand on the table. I had never felt so lost and betrayed in my life. I wanted to confront him, to demand the truth, but how could I? I couldn't just accuse him of something without knowing for sure. What if I was wrong? What if this was all in my head? But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The doubt was too strong now. There was something going on, something he wasn't telling me, and I had to find out what it was. The next day, I decided to follow him again. I couldn't let this go. Every time he left the house, I felt like I was losing control. I had to know where he was going and who he was meeting. This time, I made sure to keep a safe distance, tracking him without him noticing. He took the same route as before, heading straight to the club. My stomach twisted in knots. I had to go inside again. I couldn't just stand outside waiting. This time, I wasn't going to hide in the shadows. I was going to confront him. I had to see his face when he realized I knew the truth. I couldn't let him keep living this double life. I needed to know everything, even if it broke my heart. As I entered the club again, I felt a sense of familiarity, but it wasn't comforting. It was suffocating. I knew what I was walking into, but I didn't know what I would find. The crowd was as enigmatic as before, the conversations just as hushed and secretive. I moved through the room, my heart hammering in my chest. I spotted him right away. This time, he was alone. He was at the bar, sipping a drink, looking more at ease than I had ever seen him. There was no sign of the woman, but I didn't trust it. I couldn't trust anything anymore. He seemed so comfortable here, as if this was his true home. My stomach churned at the thought. Who was he when he wasn't with me? Who was this man that had kept so much from me? I waited for what felt like hours, watching him from a distance, my mind racing with questions. Why was he here so often? What was he doing when he wasn't with me? The more I watched him, the more disconnected I felt from the person I thought I knew. He wasn't the man I married. The man I had loved had disappeared, and in his place was someone I didn't recognize. He was still oblivious to my presence, lost in the world he had created. I wanted to approach him, to confront him right then and there, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. I wasn't ready. I had to gather the courage to face the truth, no matter how painful it might be. But deep down, I knew this moment was inevitable. Finally, I couldn't wait any longer. I walked up to him, my steps shaky but determined. I stood before him, waiting for him to notice me. He didn't look up at first, too engrossed in his drink. But when he did, the surprise in his eyes was almost comical. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice a little too casual, like he didn't have a care in the world. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. This was it. I had to ask him, had to confront him with everything I knew. The words were stuck in my throat, but I managed to say, "What's really going on here? His name? What is this place?" His face hardened, and for a split second, I saw a flicker of guilt in his eyes before he masked it with a smile. He tried to laugh it off, but I could see through him. There was no hiding anymore. "It's just a place to unwind," he said, his voice smooth, too smooth. You know, for people who don't want to deal with the usual routine. I didn't buy it. There was more to it, so much more, and I wasn't going to let him get away with this half-truth. I pressed on. "This isn't just some club, is it? You've been keeping secrets from me, and I deserve to know the truth." His eyes flickered with something. Anger? Fear? I couldn't tell. He stood up, his chair scraping against the floor, and his voice dropped lower. "We don't talk about this here. It's complicated, and you wouldn't understand." The words stung, but I wasn't backing down. "Complicated?" I repeated, my voice shaking with frustration. "What does that even mean? What's going on here? His name? I've seen enough to know this is not just some casual club meeting. You've been lying to me, and I can't ignore it any longer." The tension between us was palpable, the air thick with unspoken truths. He sighed, looking around nervously, as if he were afraid someone might overhear. "It's not what you think," he said, his tone softer now, but there was an edge to it. "This place, it's a kind of retreat, for people who need to let go. You wouldn't understand." His words hung in the air, but they didn't make sense. I couldn't wrap my head around it. Why was he so insistent that I wouldn't understand? What was he hiding? I refused to back down. "You keep saying that, but I'm not buying it anymore. I've seen the way you act around these people. You're not the same man I married." His face tightened at my words, and for a moment, I thought he might snap. But instead, he stood there, staring at me, almost as if he were weighing his options. I could feel the weight of the silence between us, pressing down on both of us. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke, his voice low. "This is who I am. His name? The man you knew was just a version I created for you. This is the real me, and it's not something I can just walk away from." My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't what I had expected to hear. This wasn't just about a secret, it was about his entire identity. I was stunned. The room spun around me as I tried to process his words. This was the man I had married, the man I thought I knew. And yet, here he was, confessing that everything I thought was real was a lie. I couldn't breathe. My chest felt tight, and for a moment, I couldn't speak. "You've been living a lie," I whispered, my voice trembling. He didn't look surprised. He just nodded, his expression unreadable. "I didn't want to hurt you," he said softly, but there was no real remorse in his voice. "I just didn't know how to tell you. I thought if I kept it hidden, I could have both lives." His words were like a punch to the gut. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My world had shattered, and all I could do was stand there, trying to process the enormity of it all. My mind was spinning, unable to grasp the full extent of what he had just said. I stood there, staring at him, feeling like a stranger had just taken the place of the man I married. "Both lives," I repeated, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, his gaze avoiding mine as if he were ashamed. Yes, I have my life with you, the one I built, the one that was supposed to be my reality. And then I have this side of me, the one I can't deny. I've been living it secretly, but it's a part of who I am, and I didn't want to lose either. The words hit me like a slap. How could he think he could have it all? That he could juggle these two completely different worlds without consequences? My heart pounded in my chest, a mixture of anger, betrayal, and disbelief rushing through me. So, all this time, you've been lying to me, pretending to be someone you're not? And now you're just telling me? After all these years, my voice broke, and I couldn't hold back the tears that welled up in my eyes. He looked at me with a mixture of guilt and helplessness, but it didn't make anything better. I didn't want to hurt you, he said again, but I could hear the lie in his voice. But I can't keep pretending. This is who I am. I can't change it. My hands trembled as I clenched them into fists. How could he justify this? How could he think it was okay to live a lie for so long? I turned away from him, needing space to breathe, needing time to process everything. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of the mess he had created. He had shattered everything I believed in, everything I trusted. You've been living a double life. His name, I said, my voice cold and distant. I've been your cover, your way to appear normal, while you've been hiding who you really are. And you think that's okay? He didn't answer right away, and in the silence, I could feel the walls between us growing thicker. His silence spoke volumes. He didn't regret his actions, not truly. He just regretted getting caught. I never wanted this to come to light, he finally said, his voice heavy with regret. But I can't go on pretending. I can't keep living in fear of being found out. It was never about you. It was about me and my need to be someone else. The more he spoke, the more I realized how much of him I had never known. He wasn't the man I thought he was. He was a stranger hiding behind a mask of normalcy. And the worst part was that he expected me to accept it, to understand it, to forgive him. But how could I? How could I accept that everything we had built was based on a lie? I wanted to scream, to yell at him, to demand answers for every question that swirled in my mind. But instead, I stood there, frozen, my heart breaking with every passing second. How long has this been going on? I asked, my voice barely audible. His eyes flickered with guilt again. A few years, he admitted. I never meant for it to go this far, but it did. A few years. He had been living this double life for years, hiding it from me, from everyone. I felt sick to my stomach. How had I been so blind? How had I missed the signs? The truth was staring me in the face, and I had ignored it, hoping that everything was fine, that my life wasn't falling apart. I couldn't do this anymore. I couldn't stand here, listening to his excuses, trying to justify his actions. I had given him everything, my trust, my love, my loyalty, and he had thrown it all away for a life that wasn't even real. I can't be with you anymore, I said, the words feeling like a weight lifted off my chest. I can't stay in this lie. I don't know who you are anymore. His face fell, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of regret in his eyes. But it was too late. The damage had been done. I'm sorry, he whispered, but his apology felt hollow. It was too little, too late. And as I walked away from him, I realized that I had finally set myself free.